Hello everyone. So today we're going to talk about fishing line and what lines I use for each lure, each type of lure, and why, and also give you some brands that I use as well, and pound test and all that, because I've tried them all. And also we'll talk about the different lines for you new guys, but tell you why certain lines are so much better for certain applications. So we'll go through the lines real quick. This is monofilament. This is the stuff that's been around forever. This is probably what your grandpa used. Probably what you started out throwing with. It's monofilament. It's the cheapest, most common, or at least was, that's around. So then we got fluorocarbon, which has pretty much taken over for monofilament now. Fluorocarbon, it does not have near as much stretch as monofilament. It's clear underwater. Just the way it's made, it doesn't reflect light like monofilament does, I guess. So this is actually used in place of monofilament for most people now. Most people don't even throw mono anymore. But I'll tell you why I do for certain things here in a minute. And the other one is braid. Braid is obviously a fabric. It is the strongest and has the least stretch. And it's just the toughest stuff. I mean, you can get this stuff hundreds of pounds test proven. I mean, it's for like ocean fishing. And that's pretty much just the three different kinds of line. Now, let me talk about the lines that I use for certain applications. For my chatterbait, spinnerbait, and square bills, and lipless crankbaits, pretty much any moving bait other than real deep diving crankbaits. For any moving bait, especially a chatterbait and a spinnerbait where they're just a single hook top hook, I'm going to be using monofilament. And the reason why is that stretch is the best for getting hook sets with those types of baits. Alright, you want that extra stretch because that bait is like going along, and most of the time when a fish is hitting that bait, it's from the back. So if you have a line like fluorocarbon with like barely any stretch on it, that fish comes from the back and goes to pull that bait, and then you're ripping it from the other end. There's just not enough there. It's going to move too fast, two forces away from each other. You'll end up skin hooking that fish, barely hooking it on the outside of the mouth, or completely just ripping the bait out of its mouth. You get better hook sets with that little extra stretch on that monofilament, especially with those heavier wire top hooks on a chatterbait, on a swim jig even, didn't mention that, throw it on swim jigs too, or a spinnerbait where it's just that single top hook instead of treble hooks. It really just helps you get better hookups. If you're real worried about visibility of monofilament, get the low vis green. I mean, whatever. It fades pretty quickly though. It doesn't really stay that dark green for very long. I still will throw it unless if the line gets kind of crappy. But at the same time, it's monofilament. It's a lot cheaper than all these other lines, so it's not that big of a deal. You can buy like 3 spools of this strand, which is actually the mono that I use for those applications. You can buy 3 spools of that for the price of buying fluorocarbon in the same pound test. So that is why I use this on those baits. It's the same with the square bills and the lipless crankbaits too. I just get a better hookup with that extra stretch of that line. I had too much of a problem, and a lot of people do, and they never realize that it's actually the fluorocarbon. But I tried fluorocarbon for a long time, kept switching back. I was like, I should be using fluorocarbon on this instead of still using my monofilament on it, and couldn't get good hook sets and kept losing fish, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I finally went back to mono and didn't have that problem anymore. So that is why on those baits I go with monofilament, and I want to go with a heavier pound test. I try to throw the heaviest pound test I can throw on every application. No matter what kind of line it is, I want to throw the heaviest I can get away with, to be honest, all the time. And I have found that 17 or 16 pound stren is the best for chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, all that stuff that I mentioned, whatever. So I'll just stick with the 17 pound stren and don't have any problems with it. Line visibility also is not a huge deal with moving baits, and I'm tired of people saying that. Maybe if you're really slowly rolling it, even though on a chatterbait I usually really slowly work those baits. I've talked about this before. The best way to fish a chatterbait is just slowly roll it on the bottom so it's barely ticking. But it's a moving bait that that bait's usually going right in front of their face, or it's popping out of the grass or whatever. It's a reactionary bite. They're not sitting there staring at it and looking at that line. So I don't think line visibility is a big deal on moving baits, unless if maybe the water is absolutely 20 plus feet visibility, like gin freaking clear. So I don't worry about it. Go with monofilament on those moving baits. Now, for deeper diving crankbaits, like I was talking about, stuff over 10 feet pretty much, but especially once you get down to like the 20 feet divers or whatever, things like that, then I actually like the fluorocarbon better. Fishing deeper, it's harder to detect bites sometimes, and the no stretch leads to more sensitivity on fluorocarbon than it does on monofilament. So it's easier to detect bites on those like 20-foot deep diving crankbaits. And also, you don't need that extra stretch because you got a lot more line in the water. The stretch isn't as important as when it's shallower and things like that. So I'll usually go with a fluorocarbon on my deep diving crankbait rod and reel for fishing those deep diving crankbaits. As far as pound test, I hear guys talk about like throwing 12 on a deep. That's kind of crazy. I'll stick 14 to 17, 14, 16, 17 in that range. Won't go over that. 16 or 17 is really depending on the brand, because some of them make like 16 and 17, some of them whatever, and the difference, you can kind of feel the difference between a 16 and a 17. It's kind of thick, but usually Sunline Sniper and 16 is actually what I really like. I have used so many different fluorocarbons over the years, and finally last year I started trying Sunline and have been very impressed, and now that's like the only fluorocarbon I use at this point. Number one, it's least expensive, like it's less expensive than like Seagar or some other brands, but it's still really good, and actually I really like it. I haven't really had a problem with it at all. So, but on a deep diving crankbait, 14, 16 pound test. Alright. Now, to go with swim baits, bigger baits, I'm going to go 20 pound to 25 pound fluorocarbon. Throwing those big baits on the big rod, the heavier baits, heavier line, to make sure you're not just whipping that line off of your reel when you're fishing them, you know, and putting too much stress. You want a strong line to hold up to that heavier bait. So 20 to 25 pound, I stick with the Sunline Sniper. They also make a shooter, which is more expensive and supposed to be more for that sort of stuff, or more jig fishing. I found that the Sniper is still really good. That's what I keep using. The other thing that I use fluorocarbon for all the time now, and I've switched, and I'll talk about that in a second, is for flipping and dragging a jig. When I'm jig fishing now, I have fluorocarbon line on. Jeez. Sorry. I have fluorocarbon line on. I used to do braid, and then if the water was clear, tie on a fluorocarbon leader. I decided I started hating that connection from braid to fluoro. I didn't want an extra knot in there that could break, it could come apart, even though it really never happened. It's just something I didn't like. And then also, even when you tie a knot with a very thin knot that's supposed to come through the guides good, it still doesn't seem to come through as good as just using regular line. And then also on a jig, or flipping a jig, dragging a jig, whatever, that's where I'll use the fluorocarbon. And why is that bait is moving super slow, or not really moving at all, so that fish is at that point now seeing your line a lot easier than a moving bait. So that is why I started just going straight to fluoro, and I don't even throw braid on a flipping rod anymore, unless if it's real heavy grass. If you're punching and things like that, you use green braid, gets into there, and it has a tendency to kind of rip through the grass more, is what I hear a lot. Here we don't really have mats to punch too much, and even kind of the little things like that that I do, I still use fluorocarbon. It's on my flipping pitching rod, my jig rod, so I just keep using it instead of changing to this, and I really don't see a big problem. But if you have giant mats, maybe you want to go to like some 50-pound braid. I don't do it anymore. I just go straight fluoro. Alright? And that is it. Now, on those rods, flipping and pitching rods, and my football jig rod, whatever, dragging a jig, pitching a jig, casting a jig, whatever I'm doing with that fluorocarbon line and that jig, I'm still going to stick that 16, 17 pound test. Just because it's not as thick, it comes off the spool a lot easier than going up to like a 20 pound. People say, oh, you can't pitch with anything under 20 pounds, whatever. The difference is minuscule enough in doing that I like that sort of smaller line on it, but it's still heavy enough of a line, it's not going to be a problem. So I still just stick with that 16 to 17 pound test, especially on football jigs. On football jigs, I want the lighter line. You're in deeper cover and you're just dragging that jig on the bottom, like along rocks and things like that. So it's just dragging kind of an open water, more longer cast, dragging it along a point. So the lighter line lends itself to not being seen as well as throwing the heavier line in there, so that's kind of why I like to stick with the 16 for doing that. And then on pitching, I still usually just stick with that 16 or 17 pound test and haven't had a problem, but you could go up to 20 pounds. I used to be one of those guys that would think only 20 pounds 20 pound fluoro on flipping, cover, and all that. I haven't really seen a difference in doing that, and since I switched over to 16 or 17 pound just to try it out, and so now I've just been sticking with like that 17 pound. Alright, now braid, you can flip with it if you want. Oh, also, let's the no stretch, great for jigs. Just jack on them when you pitch that jig in there, or it's just sitting there just on the bottom, they just engulf it. The no stretch of fluoro is great. You just jack on them and get a good hook set in there. So you don't really want that stretch on those types of baits, especially for pitching when you're only 20 to 50 feet between you and your line, whatever. So that's another reason to use that. Now, braid. This is a braid that I've never even tried, so, but I just bought it off Amazon. But I'm sure it's fine, because all braid, I've noticed, is just fine. It's braid. It's made out of it's a fabric braided together to make a line. All right. How many ever strands they got? 7x, 9x, whatever. You know. Obviously, bigger the number, that line's probably going to be thicker. Just saying. I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to that. Braided line is braided line. Never really had a problem with it. For bass fishing, it's a little bit of overkill, but it works really good for topwater, and that is one of the only things I use braided line for now. Alright, and I stick with 50 pound on my casting rod, throwing top waters, 50 pound. That's it. I don't screw around with anything else anymore. I tried 65 for a while and whatever. I don't know why, just to try it. I've gone lighter, no real advantage to it. Just the 50 pound. Reason to use these for top waters is it floats. Right? It floats, it's tough, which is really important when a bait is on top and then a fish hits it from the bottom and brings it down. There's a lot of shock, because then all of a sudden you're setting the hook. It's a lot of different shock going on. So a stretchy line is going to really wear itself out. And braid, it doesn't do that. And then also with the floating, it keeps, since it just floats on top of the water, those top waters, it's just going to keep them staying where they're supposed to, instead of if you have a heavy mono on it or something that wants to kind of bring it down a little bit. Braid's just the way to go for top water. Like I said, guys flip with it, totally fine. I personally don't, and I don't really like it. So that's really the only thing on a casting rod I use braid for now. 50 pound braid. I just go with the low vis green, whatever, or black. Even especially if you're throwing a top water exclusively on it, I don't really think that matters, but I just stick with that anyway now. So that's it. As far as brands, you can really get anything. This reaction tackle stuff was actually super cheap on Amazon. There also used to be some weird like Japanese brand that I would buy 1,000-yard spools of in black, but I haven't seen it now. That was super cheap, but this stuff, it's a 1,000-yard spool, and I don't remember exactly the price, but you can look it up. Or I'll put a link to all these lines and everything in the description, obviously, so you can go check them out and buy them. Alright, now there's one more, and I didn't actually bring that spool in here, but there's one more application that I use braid for. A spinning rod. I put braid on all my spinning rods now, because it casts so much better. It's amazing how good with a little weightless bait on a casting rod, or spinning rod, sorry, with braid, just how much smoother that cast is. You're not dealing with those little knots that you get sometimes in your spinning rod when you're using fluorocarbon or mono. And just, you know, like 20 to 50 more feet out of the cast, whatever. It's a lot easier. It's so much better. It's the best for a spinning rod. It doesn't get all bound up, and it's not a pain in the butt. You don't get nicks in the line from it getting all bound up, and it just casts better. It's awesome. But what I do is, so on those, I use 10 to 15 pound braid. Alright, 10 to 15 pound braid. It does not matter the brand. This time I definitely stick with low vis green or black, but 10 to 15 pound braid. Okay, and then on that I tie a fluorocarbon leader, 3 foot to 5 foot. This is Seagar. This is 6 pound leader. So the reason I'm throwing a spinning rod and reel is for light line. To use light line, with a light bait, finesse. That's the only reason I throw a spinning rod. I use casting equipment on whatever I can get away with. But if you want to, if you're struggling to get bites, you're fishing deeper, there's certain times you know the fish are going to be biting this or that. That lightweight application with very light line will get you bites when nothing else can. And that's really when I'm using that spinning rod. So I go with that 10 to 15 pound braid on there, and then a fluorocarbon leader, 6 to 10 pounds. I don't go over 10 pound leader fluorocarbon on that leader, because if I can use something over 10 pound fluorocarbon, I might as well just be throwing my casting rod. So 6 to 10 pound fluorocarbon, depending. Just play it by ear, but really a lot of times I'll stick with the 10, unless if I really feel like I need to drop down to 8 or 6. I don't go below 6 either, because that's just silliness. 6 is super light and super thin, and no one's seeing that. And it's sometimes can be super dangerous depending on what you're doing. So going any lighter than that is just crazy. Usually 10 pound is what I'll stick with, but I will go down to 8 or 6 every once in a while. So that's pretty much it. I mean, that's what I've covered everything now. So yeah, monofilament on chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, square bills, and lipless crankbaits. Fluorocarbon on deeper diving crankbaits, and flipping and pitching, and also dragging a jig or just using a jig in general. Fluorocarbon. Braid specifically for topwater baits for me now on a casting rod, and then braid also on all my spinning gear with just a fluorocarbon leader. That's it. Those are the lines. I'll probably do another video on knots and things like that too, probably next week. That might be the next Tuesday video, we'll see. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Anyway, that's it, and I'll see you guys on the next one.